Nature or nurture? A question as old as it is divisive among scholars. Are we born with most of our moral attitudes, norms and values? Or are we a blank slate that culture can mold into its own liking? In this episode we will take a fresh new look at this ancient debate. Let's dive in. Only a Sith deals in absolutes. We don't want that, so today's debate about nature versus nurture is typically not dealt with in extreme opposites. The nature side of the debate, or nativists as they call themselves now, don't claim that all of our moral beliefs are innate. Of course, we can see how culture can shape some of our moral norms and values. We might be individualists, collectivists, more or less open to immigration, and so on, depending on culture. The nurture people, let's call them empiricists, don't deny that we are born with some stuff that is really fundamentally important for morality. The ability to feel empathy might be one of these things. If you're not born with it, you might have a hard time being a moral person later on. So today's disagreement between the two positions is nuanced. Put it more concretely, today's debate focuses on a couple of important moral principles and quirks of our moral architecture, where nativists try to make the claim that we are born with them. Let us take a look at what these quirks are and what the nativist's argument is. The nativist central case currently focuses on two related arguments: the argument from moral grammar and the argument from the poverty of the stimulus. These arguments have previously also been made in other debates, especially in the debate on language, where Noam Chomsky has argued that language follows an innate structure that people all over the world follow without having to learn this intricate structure of language explicitly. Nativists now make an explicit analogy between language and morality in this regard. Here's how the argument works. We first start with the observation that there are moral principles or patterns of judgment that have two distinct characteristics. First, they appear to be universal across all cultures, and second, they appear to emerge early in a child's development. There are many different ways to carve up these characteristics of how we think about morality, but here I will just focus on giving you a couple of illustrations. Try to see if you also make moral judgments in accordance with these principles. Action versus omission. People tend to think that bringing about harm by an action is worse than bringing about harm by omission. If you're drowning someone in a lake, that is typically considered to be even worse than simply watching someone drown in a lake because of an accident and not doing anything about it. Doctrine of double effect. Intending for a bad consequence to happen is worse than merely foreseeing that consequence. If a country actively kills civilians in a war, this is seen as worse than if a country merely foresees the killing of the same number of civilians as a means of bombing military bases, for example. Moral universalism and the moral conventional distinction. People typically think of moral rules as to hold universally and independent of any specific authority, such as the rule to respect property and not to kill others. These kinds of moral rules are different from conventional rules, such as don't wear sweatpants to work or school, where these only hold for certain contexts and depend on a specific authority. These are just a couple of examples, but let us see whether these indeed appear to be universal and emerge early in child development. For the first point, we need to consult cross-cultural research to find out whether these patterns of moral judgments are universal. And indeed there is some telling evidence. A big cross-cultural study looked at the judgments in sacrificial dilemmas, that is, for example, trolley cases, and collected data from over 70,000 participants in 42 countries. They find that in very rough sketches, people in all countries have similar judgments in cases of sacrificial dilemmas. This points to a universal feature of our cognition. But there are nonetheless specific differences across cultures, such as how much people are willing to sacrifice for the greater good. What is universal is merely the more foundational observation that people are hesitant to intentionally harm in order to save the greater good, but they are fine to let harm happen for the same goal. What about the development of such patterns of judgment? Here we need to look at studies that focus on the development on moral behavior in children, or even better in toddlers or babies. It's quite fascinating that we see traces of moral sentiment very early in a child's development. Children as young as 9 months old appear to express empathy in response to seeing others in need. And between 9 and 15 months, they anticipate others' needs and even expect others to do so as well. But the more complex types of judgments don't emerge as early. The difference between intending wrongdoing and merely letting it happen doesn't appear to play a role in a child's cognition before the 3rd year of development. Earlier than that, the outcome alone is predominantly important. Results are mixed for preschool children, but after the age of 7 we can slowly see that children pay more attention to the intention of moral actions. Also, we can see the moral conventional distinction already in early and middle childhood. So even though a lot is still not entirely clear, as tapping into the mind of children, toddlers or even babies is of course extremely tricky. Still, the nativists can make a good case that many of the central moral concerns have been developed by middle childhood already. On top of these findings, nativists can add the poverty of the stimulus argument. The basic idea is that people all over the world endorse the same fundamental moral principles and have the same structure in their moral judgments, without having been taught any of this explicitly. People already display them at a time where not much teaching could have taken place. And most people can't even articulate moral rules, such as the doctrine of double effect. And if many people can't even articulate these things, they won't be able to teach them. So the best explanation for the universality and early emergence of these rules and structures of judgments is that they are innate. This is the nativists' argument in a nutshell. The nativists have made their case. A lot of our basic moral structure appears to be universal and available from early in our development, without much input from the outside. So nativism it probably is. How could an empiricist counter the nativists' claim? In principle, there are two ways. They could first simply reject the data that nativists gave them. That would mean that they would have to show that the structure of judgment we talked about is not universal, or is not really there from an early age. The other way to respond would be to show how the moral structure that we talked about could indeed be taught and learned. This is the response that I want to look at in this video. What explanation do empiricists offer? Some researchers have tried to show how learning stuff from very little data is in principle nothing unusual for human learning, and that learning from little stimulus is even found in children. Here's an easy example to get us started. Imagine your friend has 4 dice, a 4-sided one, a 6-sided one, an 8-sided one and a 10-sided one. They now pick just one of these dice and roll it at random 10 times. Here are the results of the 10 rolls. Your friend now asks you to guess which of the dice they picked based on these rolls. So which one do you choose? In principle it could have been any of these dice, but you probably went for the 4-sided dice. If it was any of the other dice, we would have expected the sides above 4 to also be in the results at some point. But as this isn't the case, the 4-sided dice is more likely, though it is not guaranteed. This is an example of statistical inference, and empiricists use this type of inference making to also explain how people can learn norms and patterns of judgments with little data. If that works, they can counter the poverty of the stimulus argument by the nativists. If they have an alternative explanation as to how people can learn norms based on little data, empiricism is at least back on the table. Let us look at the difference between intending something and allowing something to happen and try to see how well the empiricist's rejoinder works out. As mentioned above, we're looking at the phenomenon that people appear to focus much more on the relevance of actions that have been brought about intentionally, rather than things that are merely allowed to happen. We are now looking for an explanation how people learn to make this distinction based on limited data. Similar as in the case where you guessed just now that the dice would be likely 4-sided based on limited data. Here's how researchers went at investigating that. Imagine you are given the following examples of rule violations. John puts a ball on the shelf. Mary puts a cup on the shelf. Fred puts a pencil on the shelf. So what rule do you now derive from these limited examples? In principle, several candidates emerge, the same as with the dice. Let us focus on 2. The rule that you ought not to put things on the shelf, or the rule that you ought not to put things on the shelf or leave them on the shelf once they are already there. The 3 examples just given violate both norms, because people put stuff on the shelf and leave the stuff on it. When participants in studies are only given rule violations that are more clearly in line with the narrow rule, don't put stuff on the shelf, they infer that this is the rule in question. They don't infer the broader rule without additional evidence, the same as with the dice example. You wouldn't pick the 10-sided dice. If you are explicitly also given examples of rule violations where the violation is described as leaving stuff on the shelf rather than putting it there, then people infer the other broader rule. Don't put stuff on the shelf, and if there is stuff already on it, don't just leave it there. Now, in order to explain why people tend to go through life adhering to the narrow rule, don't do this and that, rather than the wider rule, don't do this and that and also don't let that happen, we need to look at how we communicate rules to people, especially children. The researchers looked at a database that is called CHILDIS, an acronym for Child Language Data Exchange System. The database has lots of transcripts from communication among children and stuff parents said to their children. The researchers were able to look at how rules are communicated to children, and fitting with their thesis, they claim to find that 99% of communicated rules of adults to children are consistent with the narrow scope interpretation of rules. In a nutshell, parents tend to say to children, "Don't do this," much more often than they say, "Don't let this happen." As for a last point, let us quickly look at the moral conventional distinction. The phenomenon here is that people, and also children, distinguish between rules that depend on a certain authority, such as schools and the clothing they require, and rules that are independent of any authority, such as "don't hit people." Here too, nativists argue that what we have is a set of complex, articulated abilities that, first, emerge over time in an environment that is impoverished with respect to the content and scope of their mature manifestations, and two, appear to develop naturally across the species. Here the empiricist's response is that people, and children specifically, can learn from how much consensus there is on rules or statements, whether these are universal or relative, that is, moral or conventional. Take a non-moral example first. If you are in Europe and think that July is a summer month, you will learn that a lot of people across the globe, for example in Australia, will not agree with that. If instead you ask them whether summer is the season of hot weather, many more will agree. From agreement and disagreement, we can roughly infer whether things are universal or relative. The same reasoning counts for how children learn different norms. No matter where they are, they will hear that hitting another kid is wrong, whether it is at home, at school, in the park, or on vacation in another country. When it comes to other rules, such as take off your shoes when you enter a building, they will learn that there are many different contexts where these rules depend on the circumstances they find themselves in. Again, we might not need many instances of rules to make inferences, even if these inferences of course might turn out to be wrong. Simply knowing that it is okay to wear sweatpants at home and at a friend's place, but not at school, might be enough to show that this is not a universal, and thus not a moral norm. But wherever a child hits another person during an argument, they will be told off for that. So it is not hard for them to infer from these limited cases that they are confronted with a universal and thus moral rule. So this is the empiricist's rejoinder to the nativist's argument from the poverty of the stimulus. The response consists in showing how adults and children can learn moral norms based on very little data. To be fair, this does not prove that the rules are not innate. Empiricists admit as much. This only shows that there is an alternative explanation for why these rules emerge universally and early in development. Or does it? I think empiricists still have other problems to solve. First, they need to explain the universality of these judgments as well. Why is it that all of humanity appears to be taught fundamentally similar patterns of judgments and norms, even if these may be different in detail from culture to culture? Either it is just a curious coincidence, which doesn't sound likely to me, or there has to be another reason why teaching such norms is done universally. Empiricists would also, of course, need to show not only how statistical learning explains emergence of norms in early childhood, but they also need to actually show that this is in fact what is happening. The next years of research in this topic will certainly be very interesting, so subscribe to be kept up to date if we make any more progress in this debate.